Good morning. Hope you're enjoying this nice Sunday, February 23rd, 2020, Pisces new moon, and yeah, who's feeling the Pisces energy? You know, the Pisces, the Redeemer, and the sinner, the damned and the redeemed. You know, these are often in culture defined as two separate things, but they're like the two fish tied at the tail together. You know, can't have one without the other. There's like a kid song that does that. I can't remember how it goes. You know, something I wanted to talk about today are, you know, the archetypes of Capricorn, the devil card in the Torah. You know, somebody came to me with a good question on this, and I've been thinking about it, these three archetypes a lot. The past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and you know, when I think about it, it'd be early in the morning and I want to get up and write about it or do a video. But then, like, the impulse just goes away. It's not fully cooked, so I just let it sit. And over the past few days, I noticed it's time to start talking about it. So the Capricorn archetype is very complex. You know, you've got spirit has descended into the densest form of matter that there is. And, you know, the ancients talked about the goods, or goodness. You know, and the highest good was spirit, spiritual energy, and the lowest good was matter. Or the alchemists would call it prima materia. And this lowest form of good, matter, is our own basic instinctual nature. You know, the other side of Capricorn is Cancer, and Cancer is the gate into incarnation, and Capricorn is the gate of ascension, where matter climbs up to spirit. And Cancer, instinct, natural response, you know, which is basic intelligence. You know, in Tibetan Buddhism, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche talks and teaches a lot about basic goodness within all of us, and it expresses itself in many diverse different forms. You know, and all these are just trying to point the way towards, you know, nature within ourselves. You know, so Capricorn, you know, it's a very cardinal sign. So it's about movement and initiation. And when Capricorns get moving on something, it takes a while of planning, strategizing, but then they don't really stop. And that brings us to the first archetype of Capricorn, the mountain goat. You know, this is like the CEO, the entrepreneur, somebody like Jeff Bezos, you know, working so hard against all odds to achieve something, and then they achieve it, and then they get known as what? The GOAT. Michael Jordan, another one. You know, the shadow side of this one, you know, the obvious is ruthlessness. This natural, instinctual tendency for motivation going, you know, relentlessness gets crystallized in the mind with thoughts, you know, getting separated from nature from some sense, that you know, my goal is what the world should surrender to without considering someone else's opinion. It gets like ruthless, and through a not looking at the whole picture, looking small and selfish, thinking from the and acting as if the ego was mattered. And you could see the shadow side of this played out. Michael Jordan, another GOAT, during his Hall of Fame speech, he started talking about, his motivation being like cut from his high school basketball team, and it was quite bitter. And that's where the mountain goat, can be real curmudgeon and bitter. But then they also talk about their motivation. Cardinal signs are about being motivated through a past hurt, like shame, rejection being a motivator. Something Jesus said in the not the New Testament, the Gnostic text that we recently discovered, I think, the Gospel of Thomas, like, you build with the cornerstone that the builder rejected. And there's something about that shame of that and tying into our own basic nature or basic goodness. The next archetype of Capricorn, after the mountain goat, has achieved some successes and failures, oscillated between king, aesthetic, back and forth, success, failures, opulence, indulgence, lack. Eventually gets settled onto the scapegoat. And the scapegoat is where the mountain goat begins to turn spiritual. For an example, what's a good example? Okay, Jeff Bezos, I think, works out somewhat well here. Because I've heard he's at Burning Man, and Burning Man is a spiritual type experience or gathering, where people look to do good with their resources, instead of using them for selfish purposes solely, or to the best of their knowledge, without their blind spot created by the inability to look at the basic goodness, shame, core wounding patterns. Starts getting the blame for people. They vibrate higher and become more magnetic, and they make enemies out there with people who are selfish mountain goats themselves in some way, with powerful enemies. Like, and with Jeff Bezos, a lot of things come out about he doesn't pay any federal income taxes. And what most people don't know, in these stories, is that federal income tax, you can get, there's certain workings within the code for research and development, and he's doing a ton of research and development. And that's been around for a number of years. It's accessible to anybody who's able to achieve things like that. Not many people are. And then so they get blamed for it. It's like where people's inability to take responsibility for themselves, it's easier to blame someone else. And I was just listening to a Leonard Cohen song, and there's like he talks about a paradox of blame, or there's a paradox to blame, and I believe this is where like the scapegoat, portion is where the Capricorn starts to gain some of their spiritual abilities. It's like a sacrifice of that ego, in order to achieve worldly success as the mountain goat. You've got to be able, almost impervious to blame. And if you take yourself too seriously, blame other people's projections are going to absolutely destroy you. Because people out there are all in all sorts of hurt. And, you know, if we've seen from Twitter, other forms of social media, people have all this negative emotion they're looking to store somewhere, or maybe they just have nothing to do. They're bored, you know, bored teenagers, and boredom is like embers for anger. So it's like, oh, I'm bored, let me just cause this mayhem and mischief. And the scapegoats, it's like another good way to describe a scapegoat, spirituality. There was this ancient Sufi group called the Blame Takers. I don't know much about them other than that they exist. And there's like that paradoxical power there. And I just learned about a discovery of, you know, certain invisible forces within nature. I forget what it gets called, but are attractors. There's I was listening to the Eric Weinstein podcast. Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the name. All right, well, that doesn't need to be revealed there. But, you know, at some point, the blinders come off of the scapegoat, and they start to understand their true motivation for this quote-unquote spiritual sacrifice at some point. You know, as they ascend and further ascend the mountaintop of spiritual ascension or enlightenment or evolution, you know, whichever way you want to look at it, that they get sick of taking all the blame, and then they question their motives down to the core. And this is, you know, where the dark night of the soul begins to kick in. You know, where you could almost see, they actually almost see it, and you could see this in like superhero movies. It plays out very well, where the enemy makes a compelling case to the hero that they're not so different. You know, I'm thinking of this James Bond quote. It's like, Bond, you're not so different, you and I. And then he sees it and he gets horrified. But then, what kind of brings it there? It's like this basic goodness that the hero has. It's often acted out. They never talk about it. That the villain seems to lack. And, you know, that's this ultimate disconnect from nature, where, let's say, an arch-villain might sacrifice a woman or a kid to achieve some quote-unquote greater good. The hero would say, like, you know, be reviled to his core, be like, oh, why do you even need this? You know, how do you know you're going to solve all the problems? Are you arrogant enough that you can advocate for the forces of creation directly? And it's like, if that's your foundation, it's like, it's faulty. And that's sort of like the underlying fundamental disagreement. You know, we're talking about the Pisces new moon between good and evil. You know, is it connected to goodness or not? And it getting this step from the scapegoat to the next step, which is almost like the mythological Capricorn beast. You know, I call it the unicorn, the dragon, or the they talk about it in mystical texts as the initiate. Where there's a cop here about to give tickets. I don't know if he's going to give me one. I don't know if I'm going to stick around for it. So backing up slowly. And the initiate, okay. the unicorn, somebody who we get fascinated with, and we don't know why we're fascinated with. This is where like celebrity starts to come into play. Somebody like I'm trying to think of anybody in real life. Maybe Gandhi. Yeah, I think Gandhi would be a good example, because Gandhi didn't even speak really when he taught. People would just radiate, magnetize towards him. And I heard a story yesterday about it was one of the Osho books, it was like the Book of Secrets, and they were talking about the Buddha. When the Buddha first started I guess on his spiritual path, he renounced the world, his birthright, which was a kingdom. He became an ascetic, which is kind of like a homeless person. And while doing this, he realized what he was doing didn't make sense, because he was harming himself more often than not. And when he shared this to like 5 people following him around, they rejected him at first. And then the Buddha went on his sitting. He found enlightenment. And when he found enlightenment, the memory of these 5 disciples came up very, very strongly. And he's like, I've got to find them. So he sought out to find them. And eventually he did find them after a sense of despair, like that scapegoat journey, that dark night of the soul. When he found them, they dropped to their knees and in submission, in a submissive posture, like the hands are on the floor. And he was saying to them something like, you don't have to bow. Or that he wasn't expecting that, because they were quite mad at him when they left. And he's like, no. And the disciples were like, no, we're not doing this. We're not choosing to do this. This is happening to us. He became so magnetic that they just went into obedience. It was an unsaid thing, where just being in the presence of him commanded such respect, reverence. And those are the mythological beasts of Capricorn, where I believe the master DK or Alice Bailey, I don't know if she was transmitting for him or writing herself on this, they talk about in this book, The Labor of Hercules, and the sign of Capricorn is the most mysterious one out there. And that if the true sign of it were to be drawn, it would be almost too powerful, something they said. And one of the myths, the Greek myths, which I believe is so beautiful, I heard it, I latched onto it. What a good metaphor for what the story is Zeus running from Kronos and being nursed in a cave by the goat Almathea. And she was a one-horned goat. And, Zeus, in gratitude for her, ascended her into heaven as the constellation Capricorn. So yeah, those are the Capricorn archetypes. You've got the mountain goat, scapegoat, and then the mythological one, the sea goat, the unicorn, the dragon, the initiate, the avatar. Yeah, so have at it. Let me know what you think.